Karnataka chapter of ISAR. She is the Vice President and founder member of Fertility Preservation Society of India as well as the PCOS Society of India along with Dr. Durusha. She is also the principal course coordinator and examiner for the fellowship and certificate course in reproductive medicine at the Rajiv Gandhi University of Health Sciences, which is under Karnataka, and Indian College of Obs and Gynec. Also, it is jointly accredited by ISAR and Aspire. She is member of International Reproductive Medicine Research Network. She has written several chapters and edited several books, publications in national and international journals. And just for the benefit of the audience, this madam has not put in her official introduction, but it's a personal message that madam had told me once, that this talk that madam is going to take, she has actually undergone training in biostatistics with Dr. Siladitya Bhattacharya at UK, where she had spent her own money and attended this course. So I think straight coming from horse's mouth would be wonderful. Thank you, madam. I will not be interrupting you. I'll be on mute now. Madam, you can start.
Thank you, Sachin,
Thank you.
and thank you, Rajesh, for inviting me here.
Thank you, Guru.
Many times, I think this topic is important as to how you interpret an original article, systemic review, and meta-analysis. Is basically because many a times when we read the any paper which comes to the journal and something new is there, and we just really bother to read only the conclusion, and then we think, oh, this article says this, and so we should do it. And that's how what has happened with freeze all, freeze for all, rather not freeze all, freeze for all. And there are many people now who are wanting to do freeze for all. And if you look at all the evidence, when you look for freeze for all, you can see that there are should not work. And therefore, interpreting the result is very important. So why do we know why should we know the level of evidence? And that is basically because we need to practice evidence-based medicine, which is very important. And what is evidence-based medicine? It is the process of systematically finding, appraising, and using the contemporaneous research findings as the basis of clinical decisions. So the practice of evidence-based medicine is the integration of individual clinical expertise with the best available external clinical evidence from systemic research and patients' value and expectations. So basically, what are the different research designs? So you have exploratory, which you have the qualitative and quantitative, and you have conclusive designs where you have descriptive and causal research. So in the descriptive, you have the longitudinal design, you have the cross-sectional design, and in this cross-sectional design, you have the single and multiple cross-sectional design. So what is then qualitative research? Basically, it is the content analysis or historical or ethnographic narrative of phenomenological grounded theory case studies. Then what is quantitative? It could be experimental or quasi-experimental. It could be a single subject. It could be a correlational study. It could be a casual comparative study or a survey, which we do. And the third is probably a research by a practitioner, wherein probably he really does not apply that much of biostatistics and is his or her own clinical experience. So we have animal studies. So basically the animal studies are basically done when we bring in any drugs. So they have to be first tested in the animals and then we do the human studies. But most of the other research basically has done primarily in the humans. So what are the different types of studies? So first you have observational studies, which is right at the base of the pyramid. And these are case reports, surveys, cohort studies, cross-sectional studies, and case control trials. Then you have experimental studies, which are either randomized control trials or non-randomized control trials. And then you have the research synthesis, which is at the tip of the pyramid. And this is which is going to give us the evidence. So when you look at the spectrum of evidence, so you need to go at the horizon scanning, that is, as I've already said, animal and human studies. Then you have the innovative practices like the case reports, case series, and initial RCTs, and the established practices where you have RCTs which are showing effectiveness. So some RCTs, if they have very small number of subjects, are not going to give us the effectiveness. And probably they'll just tell us whether it may be good or not. And therefore, there are so many RCTs when we read, they say that further larger RCTs are required to utilize this evidence. And then you also could have continuity research on safety. So when you look at the background, what all do you look at? One is the history, the purpose of research, the intervention development. Then when you talk about type of studies, what all we can analyze. One is the treatment protocols. We can analyze the diagnosis, the prognosis, as well as harms. And this is basically more so for the drugs. And then what we can assess and apply is the bias, the quality of evidence, and this evidence, whatever we gain from the systemic reviews and the research, we can apply it in a clinical practice. So when we are interpreting the studies, there is a certain checklist which we need to keep in mind. One is the internal validity, wherein you have an appropriate research design and a review for the source of bias. External validity, where you have protocol explained and reproducible as well as a relevant population. A statistical part with adequate sample size reported. Then you have to look at the outcome measures, which should be valid and reliable. And they have to be minimal clinical important differences which are noted in the outcomes. Then you have the descriptive statistics, where you can have the mean, standard deviation, percentage, as well as standardized value reported. Effect size, you need to look at standardized as well as the reported. So you might have a particular sample size which is needed to see that this study is valid. But many a times we don't use that number of subjects, and probably use a smaller subjects, and therefore we have to see whether the reported number of subjects is really the effective value what was required. Then you also look at the confidence intervals, which are used to report the means, group differences, effect size, and or odds ratio. And then you have the magnitude-based interferences, where you look at the outcomes reported in terms of trivial, harmful, or beneficial use of the different descriptors which are there. So how do you start the research process? One is you choose a topic, then you review the literature on that topic, and then you define as to which problem of that topic you want to choose. Then you plan a research design, you determine a sample size, you gather the data, and then you process and analyze the data, and then you can conclude and you can report. Then when we look at the study designs and the diagnosis in question, so when you have the RCTs, where we know that it is going to tell us whether this test is going to be effective, and the problem is that it cannot tell us accurately about the same. Then when you look at the prospective cohort study, it assesses only the accuracy, and possibly there could be a bias. When you have a historical cohort, it assesses the accuracy, but again, it has an additional bias more than a prospective cohort study. And case studies are basically all pilot studies, and they are not valuable at all, and they cannot be used as evidence. Then coming to the different study design. So if you have a RCT which is parallel, it has less bias and it has a narrow disadvantage, is that it has a very narrow range. Whereas when you do a crossover RCT, it has less variance, but again, it has very few indications, so we cannot do it in all patients. Basically, it can be done mostly for when we are going to experiment on some particular drug, whether it's going to work for that problem or not. Then you have where when you have only the number of one RCTs where you have less variance and only relevant to a subject. Then you have prospective cohort where it is interoperative and it has bias between the groups. And a historical cohort or case control basically is a ready-made data. That is what we have already done. We're just analyzing that data, and it can have many sources of bias because we are not really looking at the confounding factors when you're doing a historical cohort or a case control. And then you have case series wherein you just have one case, or you have about 4 to 5 cases. It's just simple and direct, but it is not evaluable and it cannot be used again as a evidence. So when it comes to prognosis, then RCTs are not practical just for prognosis. A prospective cohort takes time and allows comparisons. Historical cohort takes less time, but is more biased. A case control is limited to single outcome, and a case series takes time, and comparison is basically post hoc when it comes to prognosis. Then when you're looking at the harm, so if you look at the RCTs, they're not solely for harm. So because you cannot do our RCT, which is where we are going to only look at the adverse effects of or of a drug if you're doing, or whatever intervention we are using. Then you have the prospective cohort, which is okay if adverse events are common. A historical cohort is subject to bias. A case control is most likely designed, but it still has a risk of bias. And case series and case reports often are the first alarm, because many a times we don't have harmful effects seen or side effects or any intervention what we are giving. We don't have an adverse event, and therefore we might just do one case, and in that case we might have an adverse event. So that basically is a first alarm what we get, that probably this intervention can cause such a problem. So when we look at the strength and weaknesses of the different designs, when we look at the RCTs, basically we have to start with randomization. We have to look at the outcome event, and the strength is there's low susceptibility to bias, but it is expensive and may not generalize. When you talk about the cohort, it is a beginning of an exposure, outcome event, what we ascertain, and the strength is that it may be feasible if RCT is not possible, but again it is expensive and bias limits its validity. And when we come to case control, basically we start with the outcome status, and then we ascertain the exposure status, and then the strength is that it is quicker, smaller sample size is required, but bias is very likely, and therefore it limits it. Then coming reading of an article, whether we should read this article or not. And in this, it's very important that we just read the abstract, and from the abstract, we would know all these various things. So it is going to tell us the clinical question of interest. It is going to tell us the hypothesis being tested, the types of treatment or exposures being studied, the study design to be included, and the description of the study population. And the most important what we need to see, that there is no confounding factor which is present, because if it is present, it is going, the study is going to be biased, and it's not really whatever conclusion is given or the results are, if they are not going to be actually if the confounding factors are removed. So then what is a confounding factor? Basically, it is a factor that differs between exposure groups and also affects the outcome. So if you have a patient wherein we have two patients who've got a tubal block, suppose, and we are testing on a particular, suppose we're going to test on doing IVF for her, and we are using a particular media. But if this patient also has an additional male factor, then that's a confounding factor. And therefore, you cannot compare the two groups. And therefore, it is important that there is no, that we see that there's no confounding factor when we have to evaluate any intervention which is being used. So how do we minimize the confounding factor? So before analysis, we have to do a correct stratification of randomization on the known prognostic factors. And during the trial, basically identical co-interventions, monitoring and follow-up should be done. And during analysis, we have to adjust for the known important prognostic factors and adjust also for the significant prognostic factors. So a less research finding is less likely to be true when the studies conducted in a field are smaller, the effect size is smaller, and there's a greater flexibility in the design, definitions, outcomes, and analytical models. And there's also a greater financial and other interest or prejudice. Like if a pharma wants to conduct a trial, then there's going to be some amount of prejudice which is going to be present. And many times we see that there is an article which is cited n number of times, but at times it may not be telling you the truth, because the initial findings might prove wrong in the future. And it has been seen that when you have an highly cited article, that is, which is having more than 1,000 citations with efficacy claims, 16% were contraindicated by subsequent research, 16% were found to have initially stronger effects, and later they didn't have those effects. and 44% replicated also with a larger sample size in subsequent research compared with the originally high cited study. So 44% would tell us that it is that initial study was good, and 24% have remained highly unchallenged. It's also important that a data fabrication can occur even in highly estimated journals, and therefore at many times we see that articles published even in Fertility Sterility and RBM Online are retracted because there is some fabrication of the data and there is a lot of bias. There are different types of bias. So it might have, you have a publication bias, you have other research bias, and therefore it is being retracted. Then coming to the randomized control trials. So we know that they are more rigorous than the observational studies, and well-designed RCT will likely be more valid and accurate than a review-based observational study or case reports. And if the randomized control trial is of a low quality, it might show spuriously inflated treatment effect. And therefore, this was one Cochrane review on pregnancy and childbirth database, and it had 250 control trials from 33 meta-analysis. So basically, the greater apparent treatment effect in the studies of poorer quality is there. So if the studies which are included, especially when you're doing a meta-analysis, what happens if the studies are of poor quality, then you're not going to get a correct answer. So there could be a randomization issue. So here the odds ratio is exaggerated by about 41%. And if there is inadequate blinding, then the odds ratio is exaggerated by 17%. So it has to be double blinded. So nor the patient should know and not the physician should know what the intervention, which intervention is given to which group. So if you have low quality treatment favors the treatment, but then when you take a high quality trial, you can see that basically it is not favoring the treatment. And if you take the combination of two, we can see that the odds ratio is almost 1, and therefore there is no significant effect. That is, it does not favor, or it's not inferior, or it's not superior, whatever the intervention has been used. And you can see that the p-value is 0.39, the overall. But this one is showing a p-value of 0.004, which is clinically significant, but it's just a low quality trial. So many a times we need to question the results in all papers, because we know that the trials with negative results are not published, or they get published at a later date. And among the studies presented in major scientific meetings, trials with positive results are more likely to get published as compared to the negative studies. Because if it is negative, we basically would not like to publish the trial, and therefore there is a lot of publication bias. At times, we know that trials are not necessary for a particular intervention because the effectiveness of the intervention are self-evident. So one example is where you have to do IVF for a tubal obstruction. So there is a trial is not necessary for that. So it's not the intervention, it's the application that is important for research. So therefore, if you look at when we compare a pre-implantation genetic diagnosis and screening, so we know that when we are going to talk about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and the couple has a specific genetic defect, and therefore all the tests which are done, whether they are necessary or not, they are not. I mean, whether there is any doubt that we should do a trial to see that these tests should be done, they are not necessary because they have to be done. But if you're doing a pre-implantation genetic screening, basically it is for an IVF candidate with risk of aneuploidy, example for a female age. So, or you're doing either a CGH, nowadays we don't do FISH, and where you're analyzing all the 24 chromosomes, and is an RCT necessary for that? And the answer is yes. So if you look at the efficacy of any treatment under consideration, we know that we have to look at the rationale, that is the efficacy as well as the effectiveness, the design architecture, whether it is a parallel or a crossover study, factorial logistics, whether it's single or multicentric. We have to look at the sample size, whether it's fixed or a sequential sample size. And we have to also look what our aim was, whether we wanted to prove a superiority, we want to prove an equivalence, or we have to do a non-inferiority trial. So when you look at the RCT design architecture, we know that it could be either a parallel or a crossover design. And it's basically done for chronic incurable diseases, and it has and its effects have rapid onset and short duration. Conditions must be stable, and the factorial design placebos are used, wherein basically you can give a placebo plus the drug, or you can just give the different drugs what you used. And we also need to look at the number of trials conducted. So if you look at the bias and the random error, so if you look over here, if it's a large RCT, you will see that the true effect is very good, and this basically has a very, very good evidence. But if you look at a smaller RCT, you can see all these small dots are, scattered, and therefore the evidence reduces. And as you go down, when you have a large cohort study, it's much less, and when you have a small cohort study, there's hardly any true effect of that particular study which is being seen. So then how do we reduce the bias and random error? So basically, one is you have to have a large sample size, and this will reduce the effect of random error but does not rule out a bias. And a valid study designing minimizes the bias, but small valid studies are still subject to random error. So if you have to look at the reducing the bias in RCTs and epidemiological studies, so if you look at the different sources of bias, so if you have a group differ, the groups differ in prognosis. So in RCTs, how can you reduce a bias? We can do a randomization. And epidemiological studies, what we can do is a statistical adjustment for prognostic factors. When we're looking at the placebo effects, we have we can choose unarguable outcomes like birth and death. When we look at co-interventions, again, blinding of the caregivers in an RCT and documentation and statistical adjustment in an epidemiological study. Biased outcome assessment, blinding of the outcome assessor, and in epidemiological, again, you choose an unarguable outcome like birth and death. And when you go, when you do a loss to, when there is loss to follow-up, we have to ensure that complete follow-up is done. So we have to see, and if at all there is loss of follow-up, it's very important for us to report that there is loss of follow-up.
Madhuri ma'am, Sachin here. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Madam, there are marks on the screen. On your left-hand side below, there is this pen icon.
Yeah.
Yeah, and please just clear that off. That pen will clear off from annotations.
Yeah.
Hidden. Probably you can do it hidden.
Yeah.
So these marks will go with that.
They're not gone.
No, not going. So probably there is a annotation screen. You can just clear off. Just click on the annotation.
1 minute.
Yes, ma'am.
No, because now, since I've hidden now, I've done that.
So just do a right click and probably that will come. No. Not happening. Okay, let's go. Let's go. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Sachin, yeah, I have changed from the settings, main settings of from the Zoom from my computer. So next meeting onward, this is not going to be a problem. But I think this meeting we have to do something right now only, if it is.
Okay. Okay, fine, sir. Yeah.
No, 1 minute. Huh? Shall I put it as the same? As arrow or something?
That arrow that will be there. There is an option for annotation and clear. It's on the screen on the.
Yeah, left side. I know.
Yeah, so probably not the hidden one. Okay, man, let's go ahead. Madam, just a request. There were a few people who are from out of country. Their grasp is not so great with English. So if you could just go a bit slow, that would be great.
Okay, sure, sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Screen.
Yeah, probably end show and then start show again. That will probably clear.
Shall I end it?
No, it's still that thing is showing. Fine, ma'am. Let's go ahead. Let's start.
I'll just close it and I'll open it.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah, now you can start the screen share again.
Yeah.
You are able to share screen, madam?
Yeah, I'm doing it.
Yeah, perfect. So now you can just keep the annotation on clear only. Yeah,
no, I'll just not go there. It's okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, ma'am. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. So the assessment of medical, when we look at the assessment of the medical evidence, the value of the evidence about a given clinical intervention depends upon the quality of the individual research study, as well as the strength of the body of the evidence comprising all studies relevant to the intervention. So then, when we are talking about quality of the body of evidence, so what is quality? Basically, it is the aggregate of the quality ranking for the individual studies. Then quantity is the number of individual studies, the sample size or the power of those studies, the size of the effects of the intervention. And the third is consistency, which is the extent of agreement among studies, makes use of types of patients, different clinical settings, as well as different studies. So the evidence-based decision making is integrating the individual clinical expertise with best available clinical evidence from systemic research, and neither alone is enough. So you have to basically integrate both of them. So the tools for evidence-based medicine are basically systemic reviews, the meta-analysis, as well as the guidelines. So what are the steps in doing a systemic review or meta-analysis? So one, we have to define the clinical question of interest and the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the studies. We have to review the literature, sift the studies to select the relevant ones. So you cannot, if you have reviewed the literature, you've got 200 studies. So you have to choose the studies from that. You have to access the quality of studies. Then you have to do extraction of the data from the primary studies, calculate the outcome measures of each study and combine them, and analyze and present do the presentation of the results, and then interpretation of the results. So there are different clinical questions that we can ask when we're doing a particular study. So it can be pertaining to a diagnostic test. It could be to a best treatment option, whatever intervention we are going to use. Then what are the potential benefits? What are the potential risks, the effects of an outcome, and which factor change the recommended approach. So a systemic review basically addresses a clear clinical question. It clearly describes rules for including and excluding papers. A minimum quality standards have to be met. It contains a thorough, unbiased search of the relevant literature, structured presentations of the results, and can also demonstrate where knowledge is lacking and can then be used to guide future research. So its aim is to identify, evaluate, and summarize the findings of all relevant individual studies over a health-related issue, thereby making the available evidence more accessible to decision making. Whereas when we talk about meta-analysis, so it's part of a systemic review. So a systemic review that incorporates the quantitative pooling of similar studies to produce an overall summary of treatment effect is called as a meta-analysis. And this may allow recognition of important treatment effects by combining the results of small trials that individually might lack the power to consistently demonstrate differences among the treatments. So if you look over here at this diagram, if this is the systemic review, meta-analysis forms a part of the systemic review. So it is basically a way to calculate an average for more than one study. It estimates an average or common effect, and it also helps in improving the precision of an estimate by using all available data. But at times it may not always be appropriate. Whereas what is a guideline? It is a systemically developed statement to assist the practitioner and a patient in choosing appropriate healthcare for specific conditions. So how do we do the collection of data? So it's very important that we use the electronic database and from indexing agencies like Medline, Embase, PubMed Central. There are other non-indexed databases like EMET, CINHL, Biosys, etc. But we can use some of these studies, but basically it is best to use the indexed ones. Then we can also do a hand searching of journal content tables, minutes and summaries of scientific meetings and books, list of references and citations. So if you've got a particular article from the Medline, Embase or PubMed, when you go and look at the references, so or the citation of that paper which has been done, then you can use that paper for your analysis. Then records of the ongoing studies which have been registered with the clinical trial registry. Then contact with the pharmaceutical companies, which basically will not give us a good report, but there are people who do this. And contact with the fellow experts in the field of interest who can probably help you in doing the same trial with you, and therefore you have more number of cases, and therefore what we say that a multicentric trial is good because we have multiple centers doing the trial. So the number of subjects in that particular trial would be of good number. When we need to analyze the data statistically, so we have to combine the data to arrive at effect size. What is that? That's the odds ratio, variance with 95% confidence interval, and the test for heterogeneity. Then there are two graphs which we can use. All of us know about them, and that is the forest plot and the funnel plot. And we have to also examine why the studies are heterogeneous, if they are, and use statistical packages where we know that we have several choices of using this statistical packages. So then if you look at the forest plot, so this the dotted line passes across a null hypothesis or one, and there is estimate of each study is lined up on each side of the dotted line. So if it is on the left side, it favors the control, and if it's on the right side, it favors the intervention. And this is going to give us the 95% confidence line. Diamond below basically is the summary of the estimate. So it's going to calculate the summary of all these, and the two ends of the diamond are going to give us the confidence interval of this 95% confidence interval, and the size of blocks which is given is going to tell us the weight of the study. So when we are using the forest plot for use in meta-analysis, it summarizes the effect of different studies. So if you look at this, if this is the 0 or the midline, we can see if this is there, and you can see that the confidence interval is small, and therefore the sample size is big. So therefore it has a positive effect and it is significant. Here it is in the center, so we can see that there is no effect, is not significant. But again, it's a large sample size because you can see that the confidence interval is again less. So this is again having a negative effect. It's not significant, and it again has a large sample size. Here you can see that the confidence interval is so large. So though it has a positive effect, it is significant, but it has a very small sample size. Similarly, over here, it is a negative effect, non-significant, a small sample size, and this is positive effect, significant, and it has a large sample size. So basically, the confidence interval is very important. So if you have a very large confidence interval, that means the sample size is very small. So then with this, we can have the harmful, travel, and beneficial ranges when we are using this confidence interval. So if you look at if it's in the central line, that we can say that it does not have any harmful or beneficial effects, it's just trivial. But If it is negative, and depending, then it is harmful, and depending upon what sample size it is, you can have a small effect, moderate, or a large effect. And similarly, the beneficial effect also can be similar depending upon whether the sample size is small, moderate, or large. So this is actually a very important slide, I think. So we need to look at, so when you see a meta-analysis, so this is what you see, and this is a forest plot. So what all do you see in a forest plot? So one here, this is going to tell us about what the review is about. Then this is going to tell us the different study IDs, whichever we are going to include. And then you have the intervention and control group. So you have a small n and a large n. So the large n is going to tell us about the total number in the group, whereas a small n is going to tell us in the number in the group with the outcome. Then you have the relative mix, which is this, and this is the outcome effect which measures, and this is shown graphically, and basically this is shown in numerically, and it has a fixed effect model which are being used in meta-analysis. The weight is going to tell us the influence of study on the overall meta-analysis. So this is going to tell us the weight. So you can see if the weight is less, the square what you see is very small. Whereas if it is a good size weight, you can see that it is a wrong. And then this diamond is going to tell us, and this in the numerical form is going to tell us about the overall effect. And this is the line of no effect. So if it is on the left side, it probably favors intervention, and on the right side, it favors the control. So this is, and then you need to look over here at the heterogeneity. So it should not be a heterogeneous group, because if it is heterogeneous, again, there's going to be a bias. So you can see that this diamond is at the central line, that is the line of no effect. And therefore, basically, the intervention has not made a difference. It does not favor the intervention. So the p-value that is 0.7, and therefore significance. So I think this is the most important slide. So if anybody has any difficulties, they can send you a question, and I could explain it right now in case anybody wants. So then why heterogeneity is important? Because there's a lot of diversity in the different studies we have chosen. So you could have a clinical heterogeneity where we have variability in the participants, interventions, and or outcome studies. You can have methodological heterogeneity where you have variability in the study design as well as risk of bias. We have statistical heterogeneity and the observed intervention effects being more different from each other than we would expect due to a random error alone, or a chance, what we say.
Madam?
Yeah.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes.
Dr. Sandesh Kade wants to ask the he wants a re-explanation of the p-value.
Yeah. So
and how we measure weight.
The weight is depending upon the various factors, like the sample size, what you have taken, and what are the different outcomes you have measured, what are the different parameters you have examined. So that is going to give the weight. So if you have a large sample size, you have taken multiple factors, we have seen that there is no confounding factor, then the weight is more. So if you see over here, this has a weight of 77.7%. So whatever criteria required, 77.7% are fulfilled, and therefore you can see this is a bigger square. Okay. Whereas this is 17.8, so this is smaller, and this is just 4.5 because you had just one. You can see the number of intervention. This is 1 out of 100, 7 out of 27, and 1 out of 141. So this is, though the number is less, but the number of outcomes what we have got is much more. Though we have a large sample size here, but you've got outcome of only 1. Whereas in the control group, you don't have any outcomes. Okay. And similarly over here, because you have a large sample size, but then the outcome is seen only in 1 patient and 2 patients in the control group. And therefore the weight is less.
Okay. And another...
So this is going to, this is the diamond which is there, which is going to tell us whether what is the overall effect. Okay, so if this diamond is in the center, it does not have any effect. If the diamond is on this side or this side, it will have either positive, beneficial or harmful effect. So if you calculate a p-value, this is telling us. So this is indirectly telling us a p-value. So when you're calculating the p-value from all these things, if you calculate it numerically, then you're going to get a p-value of 0.7. So we know that this is telling us the p-value, that it is not significant.
Okay, madam. A couple of more questions, madam.
Yeah.
What does thin line signifies?
Pardon?
Dr. Ekika Singh wants to ask, what does thin line signifies? Thin
line. It's only the squares what we need to look at.
Okay. And Dr. Sachin Dalal wants to ask, please re-explain the confidence interval. Why small is big and big is small?
Yeah. So confidence interval. See, this is a confidence interval. So you can see that the bias is less when you have a smaller confidence interval. Okay. And therefore, I mean, you might see over here your sample size is not large, but the outcome what you have got is large. So 7 out of 27 you've got an outcome, wherein here we have 9 out of in the control we have got, and therefore the confidence interval is small. Though the sample size is small, but this size what is there, the number in the group with the outcome should be big. Whereas here, though the sample size is so big, actually you just have 1 and 2 over here, and therefore the confidence interval is larger. So because it might, when you take a graph, it might be at a different this thing. And here again, you can see it's just 1 out of 100 and 0 out of 100. So you can see this is larger than this also. The confidence, this is the confidence interval, whatever you get. And then when you're doing it, this is the total, the summary of all these 3 studies, the confidence interval is so much.
Okay. What is the difference between relative risk and odd ratio? Odd ratio.
Pardon?
Oh, what is the difference between? Just a minute. What is the difference between relative risk and odds ratio practically?
Yeah. So basically, from the relative risk, we calculate the odds ratio. Okay. So the odds ratio is the percentage of, the percentage of intervention which is either going to be harmful or beneficial. So that's the odds ratio which is calculated from the relative risk. So if you see over, if you see the confidence interval over here, it is between 0.05 to 5.9. So this is a very large thing. But over here, if you see in this study, the confidence interval is between 0.36 to 1.93. So it's very small. And therefore, it is a better thing. And this is again almost 0.12 to 72.77. So therefore, here you can see over here. So this is a confidence interval. So the larger the this thing, because we are having just 1 out of 100 where we have got the outcome. And here we have not got the outcome. And therefore, the confidence interval is large.
Okay, madam. And Dr. Dev is requesting if it is possible to explain using an actual scientific paper. He's requesting so that it becomes easier to understand if it is possible.
Yeah, that we can do it later.
Later on. Okay, madam.
And do it, but I don't have it in my slides over here.
Then another Dr. Ramesh wants to ask, how will you get scale of treatment effect?
So this is only the scale. I mean, that's what now, whether it's favoring intervention or favors control. So this is for each study. So this study is showing that it is favors intervention. Whereas this study, which has got a good weightage, is showing that there is no effect. Whereas this is a very, very small study, which has a lot of bias. And that is showing that it is favoring the control. That is, it doesn't have any, the intervention does not have any effect. So this is how it is going to tell. So this,
if it is
on this side, it depends on where, if you put favors intervention on this side or favors control on this side, you can put it on either side. So it will give you anyway on either side. So that will then tell us how it works.
Okay,
so
madam.
This is, for each study, this is going to tell us whether it is beneficial or harmful, or favors or does not favor. And then
this is
a combined effect. Okay.
Yeah, madam. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So then we're coming to funnel plot. So basically it basically plots the effect size against the sample size of the study. And to study a funnel plot, we have to look at its lower left corner, that is this place. And that's where a negative or a null studies are located. That is those studies which have no effect, that is there in the center, like how we saw. So this is similar to this portion of our graph in a forest plot. And if empty, this indicates that there's a publication bias. And note that here the plot fits in a funnel and that the left corner is not all that empty, but we cannot rule out a publication bias because there are more studies right over here than over here. So if you look at this plot now, this is a funnel plot. So this is a symmetrical plot. And in the absence of bias, because the open circles, these are the smaller studies showing no beneficial effects, whereas the closed are more in number and they're showing the beneficial effect. If you have something like this, which is a symmetrical plot in the presence of publication bias, that is, their smaller studies showing no beneficial effects are missing. Whereas this is again a symmetrical plot in the presence of bias due to low methodological quality of smaller studies, because these smaller studies, which are these empty circles, they are distributed all over the funnel plot, which is seen over here. And this thing, they indicate they're small studies of inadequate quality whose results are biased towards large beneficial effect, because you can see more number are there on this side and therefore showing a beneficial effect, whereas the solid circles are more on the right side of the dotted line and which are not showing any beneficial effect. So then if you take the study, it's a totally biased study because these are all empty circles are smaller studies. Higher. You can use a study to assess the publication bias in a meta-analysis. So if you see this, it's a perfect, I mean, it's showing the circles distributed all over. But again, here there's a empty area suggesting that there could be a bias in the small trials which are present. Then there is something called as a fixed effect and the random effect model. So in fixed effect model, what are the assumptions? You know that the studies do not differ in design and how they are conducted. Any variation between the results of the studies is due to chance, and that large studies will have less variation and so are given a heavier weight, and that bigger studies are better. This is not always the case, as we saw in that forest plot. And it's more precise than a random effect model because in the presence of statistical heterogeneity, it usually has a narrower confidence interval. Whereas if we take a random effect model, it assumes the studies are not all estimating the same intervention effect. It can be used to incorporate heterogeneity among the studies. It is not a substitute for a thorough investigation of heterogeneity and is intended primarily for a heterogeneity that cannot be explained. It accounts for heterogeneity but does not explain it, and it provides a more conservative estimate of effects, and studies are given a more equal weighting. So if you see, basically fixed effect models if it is reasonable to assume the underlying treatment effect is same for all studies. And when we are doing the pooling, we use the Mantel-Hazen test, odds ratio, whereas when we're doing a test, we have to also test for the heterogeneity. If significant, you have to then go for the random effect model. And basically there are smaller study effects and the odds ratio is about 0.77. So you can see the odds ratio is almost similar for both the random effect as well as the fixed effect models. So the random effect models, we have to conduct if the test for heterogeneity is significant in the fixed effect models. It assumes that the true log odds ratio comes from a normal distribution. And here what we use is the D. Salminen-Lairs method of calculating the odds ratio. So that's how it is being used. Then how do we interpret the results? So basically we have to look at certain points like what are the limitations of the study and the review, whatever you're reading, any potential biases of the original study which are present, especially when you're looking at the meta-analysis and a systemic review. We have to look at the potential biases that could affect the systemic review itself, the consistency of the finding and their ability, and we also need to propose the recommendations for future research on the topic of interest. So when we are interpreting the results, so let us see what are the different factors what we need to look at. So one is, are the findings applicable to my patient? So my particular patient has a condition that was an exclusion criteria in all the clinical trials included in the systemic review. And in this case, my patient would not be represented by the specific clinical trial included in the systemic review. So we have a review which is published on a particular, say we are taking a PCOS patient, wherein we have excluded one particular, we have excluded a patient who is a lean PCOS. And we have included only obese PCOS. So whatever conclusion we are having on that PCOS, the intervention we have used for that study for the in PCOS patients cannot be applied to a patient who is lean, and therefore it cannot be applicable to all the patients. So we have to read in between the lines the methodology, that is how we have selected the patient, how we have randomized the patient. And when you're reading the systemic reviews, you because those systemic reviews will also tell you about each study, what they have done and what they have used. Then the second, what we have to ask ourselves is, the intervention feasible in my patient? Is there are many regional differences in availability and or experience of applying a particular technique, differences which should be taken into account when applying the intervention to an individual patient. Then what is the risk benefit for my patient? That even if the intervention is feasible and applicable, the specific risk for a particular patient should be taken into account. And this is an aspect which is generally poorly represented by clinical trials. Suppose we are trying metformin along with clomiphene citrate in a PCOS patient, and we find that this intervention is beneficial. Severe side effect when using metformin, and therefore this cannot be tried in a patient. So therefore it cannot be used for all the patients. So you have to always assess the risk and benefit of whatever intervention we are going to try. Then what are my patient's particular values and preferences? So when we treat the patient with the best intentions, but without taking his or her point of view into account. That is, many a times we do a trial, we just tell the patient, oh, if we are doing a trial, you please sign the form. But many a times we don't really sit with the patient and explain to her what intervention is going to be different from otherwise when she would have taken treatment without this intervention. So it's very, very important that we have to discuss with the patient that we are probably going to do this intervention, but if you don't want to enter this trial, this intervention will not be done. Then you need to tell her the advantages of the intervention. You also need to tell her the disadvantages or the side effects if you're using a drug, if that particular intervention is used. So this is very, very important when you're going to use any intervention for your patient. Then coming to the various issues in a meta-analysis, there could be issues when choosing a model. So we can have a fixed effect or a random effect model. Bias in the meta-analysis because of poor quality of trials and publication bias. There could be quality control in a meta-analysis according to the Codom guidelines. And you can also, it will also depend upon the different statistical softwares what you are using for the meta-analysis. So what is this CROSM? Basically, it is the preferred reporting items for systemic reviews and meta-analysis. And it consists of a 27 item checklist and 4-phase flow diagrams. It's basically evidence-based minimum set of items for reporting in a systemic review and meta-analysis, and can be used for critical appraisal, but not designed for it. So basically, when you're doing a meta-analysis, you need to look at all these 25 checkpoints, and which you could get through this paper as to what, because you have this on the website. They have a website where you get all this, and you need to check whether when you're doing your systemic analysis and review and meta-analysis, whether all those items which are mentioned in that are included in your review. Therefore, when we are examining the results of the systemic review and meta-analysis, the following questions should be kept in mind. One is whether the apples were combined with oranges. That means there's heterogeneity among studies, which may make any pool estimate meaningless. where all the apples rotten, that is the quality of the meta-analysis cannot be any better than the quality of the studies it is summarizing. So if the studies only are not good quality, your meta-analysis is not going to tell us, give us any answer or going to give us any evidence. Then third is where the some apples left on the tree, that is an incomplete search of literature has been done, and this can result in a bias when we are doing the final results for the meta-analysis, and that the pile of apples amount to more than just a hill of beans. That is, we make sure that the meta-analysis quantifies the size of the effect in units that you can understand. So then going to the advantages of systemic reviews, we know that it uses explicit methods which limits the bias. It draws reliable and accurate conclusions. It easily delivers required information to healthcare providers, researchers, as well as policymakers. It helps to reduce the time delay in research discoveries to implementation. It improves the generalizability and consistency of the results. It results in generation of new hypotheses about subgroups of study population, and overall they increase the precision of the results. But there are certain limitations also, and we know that all research, the value of a systemic review depends on what was done, what was found, and the clarity of reporting. And as with other publications, the reporting quality of a systemic review varies, limiting readers' ability to assess the strength and weakness of those reviews. So if you have not analyzed each point which I told you on the forest plot, then you're just going to look at the gross effects and probably which might not be right. And then there are also certain inherent flaws associated with it, such as the location and selection of the studies, the heterogeneity, the loss of information on important outcomes, inappropriate subgroup analysis, and conflicts with new experimental data, as well as duplication of publication. Basically, would you reduce the bias? So once you recruit a participant, then you have, and with the allocation concealment, you can either allocate that patient for the intervention group or the control group, where here it is exposed to the intervention and here it is not exposed. And the later steps are all same, the follow-up, the outcome, and the analysis. So how can you find out whether there's a bias or not? So one is you have to look for the presence of any confounding factors. We have to look at the integrity of the intervention, what you are giving, the intention to treat, as well as the withdrawals, the blinding of the outcome assessment, the data, that is, it has to be triple blinding. That is, the physician has to be blind, the patient has to be blind, and the person who is going to find out the result for that RCT also should be blinded upon what has been used. So we have to just say A or B. We have not to say what is A and what is B. And the data collection methods, as well as the statistical analysis. So when we talk about publication bias, so these are basically studies showing beneficial effect of a new treatment more likely to be published than one showing no effect. Negative trials assumed to contribute less never show up in the literature base, which we have already discussed earlier. And use of funnel plots to examine the influence of publication bias is very, very important. So what are the cautions we need to consider when we are analyzing any meta-analysis or systemic review is that many of them often rely on few or inconsistent evidence. The industry-supported research may demonstrate greater treatment effect. Cost effectiveness analysis with industry involvement were associated with lower baseline assumptions of the sensitivity. And whenever there is an industry sponsorship, it negatively influences the physician's perception of the methodological quality, and it reduces their willingness to believe and act on trial findings independently of the trial quality. So this is very, very important what we need to remember. Then we have to use a standard critical appraisal approach when we are evaluating a scientific article. So what is it that we have to do is we have to critically evaluate the purpose of the study. So what do we have to determine? What is the rationale for performing the study? So whether the PICA, that is the question what we have asked, is the most important thing, whether that is a proper one or not. And is the research question clearly defined? So if we have asked a correct question, but whether we have clearly defined it, and whether it is clearly then included in your analysis is very, very important. And if not, whether it should have been done. And therefore, if it has not been done, then this paper, whatever it has shown you the results, is really of no value, and it is not going to give us any evidence, and it's another paper, and after some time it's going to go down and it's never going to be cited. The second thing what we have to do is to critically evaluate the design of the study. So is the design appropriate for the study? Does the sample fit with the research design, and is the size sufficient? How was the data collected? Again, this is again very, very important. And is the analytical approach consistent with the study question and the research design? Third is we have to examine whether the study has been registered in a public registry. So today, no study which has been registered is really taken into account. So even if you publish a study and you have not registered it, later on when this study cannot then be included in a systemic review or meta-analysis because it has not been registered. So this registering of any study, whatever you're doing, and especially the prospective ones. The retrospective studies, basically, you cannot register because what you're doing, you're just analyzing the data, what you have with you. But any prospective study, whether it's an observational study or it is a randomized controlled trial, has to be registered and with the DCGI. And then only it is really, you can say that this study is an original study and it can be reproducible. Then are the primary endpoints the same with the registered version of the trial? So you've registered a study and you've said that this probably we are looking at this primary endpoints, but when you're publishing the study, the primary endpoint is totally different. So you have to have the primary outcome and the secondary outcome for your studies, and you should not change your primary outcome and the secondary outcome. Then coming to whether always whether you relevant to the study, whatever has been done, that is all the references which can say, and whether it includes recent research. So if you have a study wherein you have included papers of 90s, it's not at all relevant and it's not going to really be helpful. But you have to include the literature which is in the recent past 10 years, at the most 15 years. Then does the literature review support the need for the study? Is again a very important question. And are the findings consistent with the existing literature? So whether you've seen done the review of the literature and whether the results of your study are same to that study or are they different? And then you need to say why they are different, and then you need to also mention the limitations of your study, because the literature what you have reviewed might have used some other conditions, or they would have used some other parameters, or they would have used more number of parameters, but you've not been able to use more number of parameters, and therefore what you have done may not be comparable with the existing literature, and therefore you have to always give what are the shortcomings of your study. Then we have to critically evaluate the results and conclusions. That is, are the results presented clearly in the text, tables and figures? Are the statistics clearly explained? Are the results explained in relationship to the theoretical framework research questions? Are the limitations presented and their implications discussed? And are there recommendations? Are there any recommendations for the clinical practice? So now let us go to the different categories of recommendations. So you have, so when you see a paper, we many a times see that we see that whether the study is evidence-based, has an evidence-based recommendation, wherein you have evidence sufficient to inform a recommendation made by the guideline development group. When it is CCR, that is, it's a clinical consensus recommendation. That is, in the absence of evidence, a clinical consensus recommendation has been made by the guideline development group. So that group thinks that though there's not much of evidence, in their clinical practice, they have found that this recommendation can be used. And the other one is clinical practice points, wherein the evidence is not sought. A practice point has been made by the guideline development group where important issues across the discussion of the evidence-based or clinical consensus are recommended. So if you go to the quality of individual study. So you have 4 levels of quality, and then you have the good practice points or the clinical practice points. So the level 1 is a randomized control trial, and the recommendation is A, and it is recommended or indicated is useful, effective, or beneficial. When you have a level 2, it's basically a cohort study, a prospective or a retrospective case control study. It has a B recommendation. It is reasonable, can be useful, effective, beneficial, is probably recommended or indicated. So here the word is probably, because you're not sure 100% that it should be recommended. Grade 3 evidence is where you have case series and case reports, and the recommendation is C, that it is not recommended or indicated, is not useful, effective, or beneficial, and may be harmful. And the 4th is expert committee report or opinion and or clinical experience of respected authors. And these are just conditional recommendations. And good practice point, basically, a clinician should help patients understand the uncertainty surrounding the clinical service they provided and say that probably it would be helpful and therefore you can use it. So then when you're looking at the hierarchy, the best is with level 1 evidence. And this is basically used in a wide variety of settings with confidence that they can change clinical behavior and improve patient outcomes. And at least it includes at least one prospective validation in a different population and one impact analysis which demonstrates change in the clinician's behavior with beneficial consequences. Whereas level 2 is used in various settings with confidence in their accuracy, and it demonstrated accuracy in either one large prospective study, including a broad spectrum of patients and clinicians, or it is validated in several smaller settings who differ from one another. Whereas level 3 may consider using with caution and only if a patient in the study are similar to those in your clinical settings. And these rules have been validated only in one narrow prospective sample. And level 4, and it is the clinically, and these CPRs have been derived but not validated or have been validated in split sample large retrospective database or by statistical techniques. So as I said, those are the strength, those are the qualities of studies, and that only can give us a strength, and that will give us the level of recommendation, that is A, B, C, and D, as I told you over there. So the A, as I told you, is directly based on level 1, B on level 2, and also extrapolated for recommendations for level 1. C is directly based on level 3 evidence or extrapolated from recommendations from either 1 or 2 evidence. And D is directly based on level 4 evidence or extrapolated recommendations from 1, 2, or 3. And the good practice point, as I told you, is the view of the guideline development committee. Then many European studies, you will not find 1, 2, 3, 4 or A, B, C, D. And what you find is you have this plus. So if you have 4+, it's a high quality study, very confident that the true effect lies close to that of the estimate size of effect. If you have 3+, it is moderate, and there is a moderate confidence in the effect estimate, and the true effect is likely to be close to the estimate to the effect, but there is a possibility that it is substantially different. Then when you have 2+, it is a low quality, and therefore there is a limited confidence in the effect estimate, and the true effect may be substantially different from the estimate of effect. And when there is just 1+, it's a very low quality study, wherein we have a very little confidence in the effect estimate, and that is the true effect is likely to be substantially different from the estimate of effect. And then similarly, you have the grade of evidence. So here you have 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's in the reverse order. So if you have just 1 star, it is D. I mean, the recommendation is D, wherein it is a conditional recommendation against the option. When it is 2, it is C, that is conditional recommendation for either the option or the comparison. When it is 3, it is a conditional recommendation for the option. And if it is 4, it is a strong recommendation for the option. So when you're reading a paper, when you look at the evidence, either you will have it as 1, 2, 3, 4, or you have it as these stars, 1 star, 2, and 3, and 4. So this is totally, I mean, it's totally reverse. That is, if it is 1 is the best, here in the lowest, that is the 4 is the best, and same as with the quality of evidence. So it is A, B, C, D. Here you have 4 pluses, 3, 2, and 1. That is a very low quality study. So if you look at the strength of evidence from clinical practice, so when you look at the clinical trials, the best or high strength is in experimental studies, that is wrong as the randomized controlled trials. Then to a lesser level, it's observational studies, and when you're analyzing, it is better with a cohort than with a case control. And when you talk about descriptive studies, that is cross-sectional case series, and it really does not have any evidence. So then how do we use the evidence? So you've got a particular evidence. How you use it, your use will depend on 2 factors, that is the patient factor and the physician factor. So what is the patient factor? The education, the belief, social resources, financial resources, and also the severity of the disease and the concurrent condition that the patient has. And the physician factor is what? The knowledge, whether the physician wants to implement the research evidence what is there, or he wants to stick with his own knowledge, what he has been practicing for years together. His skills, whether he can really use that evidence which is there in his clinical practice, and his experience and beliefs in using that drug or any other drug. And also on the healthcare system rules and resources. Like many things in India, especially for infertility practice, are not covered under insurance, whereas in other countries they're covered. So they can easily do a trial because it's been covered under the insurance schemes. Then it is also very important for us for a critical appraisal, and that is to see whether the process of a systemically exam research evidence to assess its validity, results, and relevance before using it to inform a decision, and also guide the interpretation of the findings and aid in determining the strength of the interference. So what are the guidelines? So if you look at it, you have to do a biomedical research. To look at the outcomes and the effectiveness of the research, and this will then give us the evidence-based information, and whether we put it into clinical practice or not again is dependent on, as I told you, on patient factor as well as the physician factor. And then out of that, then we have to look at whether what type of quality measurements have been done when that clinician is putting the evidence-based information into his clinical practice, whether it has any quality assurance and there is any quality improvement after he has used that intervention or that evidence. So many a times we feel that if there is a evidence in the books, it stands in the legal court, but it is wrong because most of the courts basically rely on expert witness. And basically we also need to see there's a concern that evidence-based medicine can become the standard of care. And we know that the standard of care is currently arbitrary, and expert-based testimony is often opinion-based and biased and thus may not be right. And therefore, actually we should use evidence-based medicine legally, but which is really not being done in our courts. So then, has this evidence-based medicine made difference in the quality of health? And we shall have to say yes, because especially when the guidelines are made, they help us in changing our practice performance. They change the health outcomes. There's a comparison of different modalities of treatment or investigations what we are using. There's change in the consumer's knowledge and the understanding, as well as it has an influence also on the economics of diagnosis, treatment, as well as the prognosis, that is the management of the entire patient. So the 4 A's are the most important when we are practicing evidence-based medicine. So one is we have to ask a well-formulated clinical question. We have to acquire the best evidence. We have to critically appraise the evidence, and then we have to apply the evidence. And then how do we then translate this research and knowledge? So we have 3 stages. So one is the first generation of knowledge where we are doing the primary research studies. The second is where there is synthesis of the research reports. And third is where the guidelines, decision aids, and economic analysis is done. And this knowledge translation is about turning knowledge into action and it encompasses the process of knowledge creation as well as the knowledge application. So we know that the knowledge is an inverted triangle where the large base is where we have to do inquiry into the knowledge. We have to synthesize the results, and then it's only a small portion of this knowledge that we can utilize in our clinical practice. So how do we go about doing it? We have to identify the problem. We have to identify and review and select the knowledge. Then we have to adapt the knowledge to the local context, access the barriers to the knowledge what we are using, select, tailor and implement the interventions, monitor the knowledge what we are using, evaluate the outcomes and sustain the knowledge use. And you can see that everything is interconnected. So we cannot just use this knowledge for one part of it, but it has to be done in a proper fashion. So the take-home message from my presentation today is that a systemic review is an overview of a primary study which contains an explicit statement of objectives, materials, and methods, and has been conducted according to the mathematical synthesis of the results of 2 or more primary studies that address the same hypothesis in the same way. And although meta-analysis can increase the precision of a result, it is important to ensure that the methods used to the review are valid and reliable. And the systemic review and meta-analysis is a way of summarizing research evidence, which is generally the best form of evidence and hence positioned at the top of the hierarchy of evidence. Systemic reviews objectively summarize large amounts of information, identifying gaps in medical research and identifying the beneficial or harmful interventions which will be useful for clinicians, researchers, and even for public and policymakers. And ultimately, it is the clinician who must make decisions regarding a particular patient, and systemic reviews are just one more tool to be used judiciously in making those decisions. So we can conclude by saying that the validity of any or a systemic review ultimately depends on the scientific method of the retrieved studies and the reporting of the data. So we know that evidence is very important and it will help us in building a safer healthcare system. So I think the Indians must be having the maximum data in the world, but basically we are unable to formulate it and put it into a proper in a statistical manner and present it. So I think once we start doing it, we'll be able to churn a lot of data. As I'm the member of that International Research Society, so many times I do ask Dr. Siladitya that why don't you give us the projects, because maximum of their projects have been done in China and in Korea. And what happens is, so I told him, why you're not giving us in India, though you're from here. So he told us that most of our ART clinics basically are all private. They are not into community hospitals. Whereas in China, I mean, they don't have any private clinics. Everything is in a community hospital. And therefore, basically, most of the research is being done over there. Shall I find a systemic review if they want? Somebody wanted to see now. To see. Hello.
Yes, madam. Everybody's saying yes.
Yeah. Let me find out how to find the review. Now that's fine. Otherwise, I think I can go on the net itself and find a systemic review. Some Cochrane review I can get.
Dr. Sachin, you are unmute.
Yes, sir. No, let Madam search.
Yeah, so you can just ask me questions. By then I'll try and
Yeah. So,
time.
sir, you want to start asking questions which are
You,
typed in the.
you can start. You can ask.
Okay. Madam, one question from Dr. Ramesh is, what is the difference between allocation, concealment, and blinding?
Allocation concealment is one person will know what is being given. I mean, the physician and the patient will not know, but the third person, whoever knows what is there in A and B.
Okay, fine.
Blinded
And,
is all the three are blinded.
All the three are blinded. Okay, fine. All right. Second question by him is, observational studies also need to be registered, and where to do the registration?
Yeah, if it is a prospective study, it has to be registered. So it has to be passed from the ethics committee, and it has to be registered with the DCI.
With the DCI. Okay, all right. So it's an online procedure?
No. You have to go through the whichever ethics committee you're going through. That committee will have the thing.
Okay, fine.
It has to be registered with the DCI, and then you have to get a number. So many a times what we do is we just pass it to the ethics committee, but we don't register it. So we should have a registration number from the DCI, the DCGI. Then only it is valid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And Dr. Dev is asking, can you please give clinical examples on how to interpret the following: relative risk, odds ratio, risk ratios, ROC curve analysis?
No, it's not. Now see, okay, I've got this. I'll just share. I'll just share my screen now.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. This was a Cochrane review, which looked at the cleavage stage versus blastocyst stage transfer. So they had included 27 RCTs, and it had about 4,000 couples. And their primary outcome was a live birth rate and the cumulative pregnancy rate, whereas the secondary outcomes were just clinical pregnancy rate, multiple pregnancy, high order multiple, embryo freezing rate per couple, and embryo freezing rate the same. So now this forest graph is basically so it is comparing blastocyst versus cleavage stage transfer. It's looking at the live birth rate as the outcome. So these were the various studies which were used. So these were the total numbers, and this is the capital N, this is a small n. So this is for the blastocyst transfer.
You're not audible, madam.
See the
Madam, you are not audible clearly.
Can people see?
Yes, but you're not audible. Your voice is cracking, madam.
Okay. Now?
Now it's fine.
No. Now, is it audible?
Yes,
yes,
madam.
No, sometimes the net is a little unstable.
Yeah, I know.
So you can see. So we have looked for this. This total is the capital N. This is the small n. So we are comparing now a blastocyst versus a cleavage stage study. And here it is giving you the weight. So you can see the maximum weight is seen in this study is over here, that is 17.5. And second is here in this Imlani 2003, which is 16. Whereas all the other studies are very low weight. So you can see the size of the squares is also very different. And here it is showing us the odds ratio. So if it is more than 1, that means it is favoring the day 5 transfer as against the day 2 or 3 transfer. So if it is less than 1, that means it is favoring the other one. But we can see that it's not, all these studies which are included are not very good quality studies, because we can see that these squares are not very small, but the effect is that it is beneficial for the day 5 transfer. And you can see that the size of the diamond is small, and therefore we can see that probably it has got a large sample size. And when you look over here, we can see that the heterogeneity is 0.04. That means it's there. Like when I showed you that graph, it showed that it was 0, 0. So there's no heterogeneity. And you can, but the overall effect you can see is the p-value is 0.0002. So it is statistically significant.
Madam Sachin here. So what I interpret is, like, if we look at an odds ratio of 1.48,
that is also significant. Yeah, and even the confidence interval is showing significance.
Yeah, no, so what my question was, that odds ratio of 1.48, does it mean that if I transfer day 2, day 3, then I will have 100 pregnancies, vis-a-vis if I transfer day 5, day 6, we will have 148 pregnancies? Yes. Does it also mean that?
Yes, yes. So if you see over here, if you see the odds ratio, so this is favoring day 2, day 3. So we are looking at whether day 5, day 6 is better. So you can see this is 0.79. So it is less than 1.
Right.
Okay. So again, this is over here, it's 0.41.
Okay.
So if it is 1, anything above 1, it is favoring day 5, day 6. It's anything less than 1, it is favoring a day 2, day 3 transfer.
Okay. And this 95% confidence in
is calculated from their sample size, that is the event n and n.
Okay, all right. So does this mean that 22 patients became pregnant out of 55 transferred?
Yes.
Okay, okay, fine. All right, got it. So from that data, the confidence interval is taken.
Yes.
So does like say for the first the second paper,
see it's very less now, so it's just 1 and 3. So you can see the confidence interval is so big.
Okay. So whenever a confidence interval is smaller, that is more relevant, more better.
More relevant.
Okay.
More relevant. So if you see even here, this is so big. So it's just 3 and 3. But here, this is so small. So you can see it's 23 and 38. Here also it is small. Okay. So it is 56 and 38. So basically, the events, that is the outcome what we have, is very important. What we are looking at.
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Madam, Dr. Ekika Singh wants to ask something. Dr. Ekika?
Yeah. Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yeah, good afternoon.
It was a very nice lecture. Ma'am, I just want to ask you one thing. For DCGI registration for private hospitals, that ethical committee cannot be an institutional ethical committee, because that has to be in a government setup. So for private hospitals, if we want to get a...
Who says so? No, all the government hospitals also have.
No, government hospitals have institutional ethical committee, but somebody told me if you are a private setup, if you have a private setup, then you cannot have an institutional ethical committee. You have to go for some individual ethical committee or something like that, and then you can go for DCGI registration. So I was a bit confused. What is this? I mean, is there something this kind of a bifurcation for the government setup and for the private setup to make an ethical committee? Hello?
Yes, madam.
Madhuri ma'am, you're not audible, madam.
I think, just a minute. I think.
Yeah, ma'am, actually can't hear you.
Yes, I am unmuted, but I am not able to unmute. Probably, madam.
Madhuri madam, you'll have to unmute yourself also.
I'm trying to unmute her, but I'm not able to do it.
Is it okay now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yes, madam.
Yeah.
Yeah, fine.
So, so what happens? So what happens is, once you have registered, so anyway it goes to DCGI, but then you have to get a letter from the DCGI saying that this is your registration number for your study. But many a times we don't take it. We just pass it through our ethics committee. Okay, but we don't really take the number of registration. So that is very, very important.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Madam, so what is the disadvantage of not registering with the DCGI?
No, so your this thing is then not valid if somebody wants to do a meta-analysis and wants to use your paper. If you don't have that DCGI registration number, then they cannot use your data.
Okay, okay. Even though if it's in an index journal.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay, fine.
And ma'am, one more thing. What is the number or the sample size which is good enough for a good credibility?
No,
I
no,
mean,
no.
It has
Each
to be
study,
100 or...
No. Each study you have to calculate a sample size depending on what is your study. There's a formula for that. So you need to take a study which has been done previously, and then you have to look at the number of whatever positive events, negative events, and the total sample size. And then there's a formula to calculate what your sample size should be.
Oh.
I don't often remember that formula to tell you.
Rajesh sir, Dr. Dev wants to ask a question. Can you please unmute him? Rajesh sir. Rajesh sir.
I think Rajesh
he's
sir
got
is
muted.
being
So, madam,
muted by himself.
only he can. So, madam, Dr.
Dev
Dev is asking,
Huh.
can you please elaborate with examples on ROC curves, example area under curve, and if time permits, role of post hoc analysis?
My God, ROC. Now I have to go. I have to have a ROC.
Yeah. So maybe tomorrow when we start, we can just with
Yes,
an example.
exactly.
We can do that.
Yes.
I mean, how to interpret ROC curve is what really we would like to know, because sometimes I also go blindfolded in what to do or what not to say in that.
Tomorrow I'll get, because it's very difficult to find in my presentations an ROC.
Right.
I will do it tomorrow morning.
So we are lucky that we have a session followed it tomorrow also. So in case there are any doubts, we can just ask first before we start with the presentation tomorrow.
So tomorrow
Yes.
I will also include in my presentation the importance of an abstract writing. So your abstract has to be foolproof to be cited. So basically when people look at your papers, they look at an abstract. So that has to be very good for your paper to be cited. And then your paper also, your results have to be good. That is a difference. But the abstract is like your face. So it's going to tell you what your paper is.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Rajesh sir, any questions?
Yeah, madam. So basically, at the outset, I will tell, we are like, as far as the research is concerned, we are teetotalers. So at this stage, most of us are more interested in knowing and interpreting the reliable papers, which is a reliable study, and which study to believe. And so that is our primary, intention, most of us. And then after, once we master that,
so that is what I told you. So when you look at the study, basically, first is you need to look at whether the PICA, that is the question what has been asked, is relevant or not. And your title and the question what you're asked is relevant or not. And when then based on that question, the aim what you put forward and your how you've chosen the methodology, whether it's proper or not, and then your results and your conclusion. So many a times if you see some papers, their results are different, and when they're concluding, they will in general conclude about somebody else's study and they'll not conclude about that study. So that is totally wrong. So that is how an original paper should be read. So first you have to look at the abstract. So you have to see whether that PICA is okay or not. You have to look whether it is proper or not. And whatever question has been asked has been analyzed in the similar way. That is, their primary outcome and the secondary outcome has been same. And then second is you have to look at the sample size. Now we have so many studies which have been done on myoinositol, and most of the studies are basically from Italy, where it is being produced, and all of our people get it from Italy. But all the studies which have been published and we say that it is effective, they have a sample size of 18, 20. That's all. So you cannot give that much credit to that study. So basically, you have to look at the sample size is very, very important. So if you're having 200 patients and more than sample size, it has to be a randomized trial. Okay. Wherein you are giving blindly, so you don't know what you are giving. So give one half, other half you will give a placebo, and then you compare. Then only it is supposed to be a good study. But if you've done a study wherein you have just done about 18 patients, you've just given myoinositol, and you've seen the effect on the effect on the weight, you've seen effect on the lipid parameters, on the blood sugar levels, or the outcome, it really does not make sense, because it's a small sample size and it's not randomized.
But sometimes, madam, what happens while we are reading the study, on one side, the clinical pregnancy rate is, say, for example, 18%, and on another side, it is a 24%. Still, they write that although it was not statistically significant, according to us, it is statistically significant, 18% and 23%.
No, it is not statistically
so
significant.
which creates confusion in our mind.
No. It is not statistically significant, because 18 and 25% is totally different. It might, percent-wise, this might be more. But if you look at the statistics, if you look at the p-value, it is not significant.
So that's why we need to understand this deeply.
Rajesh sir, Madhuri ma'am, I think Dr. Durusha ma'am has very nicely summed it up in a comment. What madam is saying that Madhuri, excellent talk. Now I think tomorrow you need to make it practical by bringing in different papers. By bringing in different papers, good and bad, and then I think everyone will have the full benefit of your talk. So I think she's probably.
I totally agree. I totally agree.
Okay. So first I will do that, and then I will talk on how to write a paper.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Sounds so good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect, madam. Thank you so much for this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope I don't know people. I hope people didn't get bored.
It's not a question of boring, but it was, see, madam, it was you have in 1 hour, 1.5 hour probably you have covered 360-degree, but probably because of our ignorance, I would say, you are not able to see. We need to go through the slide repeatedly. We have to understand a lot of technical words were used. So we have to again go into the depth and find out. So in fact, I would say you have given us exercise to work hard, because it was not a ready-made material, which was, we are not that much well versed with all the terminology.
Yeah, that is there.
Yeah. So Madhuri ma'am, until now, whatever sessions that we had, they were by people who tell you what needs to be done.
Yeah.
Your session was what you need to do. So that is what is the difference. So now we have to scratch our gray cells and really get the grasp of the papers. And thank you so very much for your effort.
Tomorrow I will also tell about the ROC curve and something else that you wanted. ROC curve and?
ROC curve and 1 second, there's one more thing.
What is something else?
You can go through the chat.
Area cover and time permits. Role of post hoc analysis. Yeah, Dr. Dev had asked.
Yeah, post hoc analysis. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, madam. It was nice really listening to you. And
so now let me find the good and bad papers, and then.
Yeah. We will also see it, go through the lecture, so that tomorrow becomes more fruitful for us, all of us. Thank you so much, madam.
yeah. No, that's what I need to find the first person now. I'll sit and do that.
Yeah, madam. Yes. Madam.
Surely. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Take care, all. Thank you very much.